Hello everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting meeting. I'm so sorry that I cannot be with you today in person due to the weather conditions. So I will be speaking now about the perception of flavor and explain why it is more than actually meets the tongue. So when we talk about food perception, we often refer to its taste, stating that something tastes good, for example. What we mean, however, is that the food looks appealing, activating our visual brain, that it smells good, activating our olfactory brain, that it sounds good once we bite into it and hear its crunchiness, for example, and only when we have it in the mouth we can assess its taste and its touch or oral texture. And when all of these sensory bits of information come together, we experience something that I like to refer to as an illusion of a coherent percept that originates in the mouth, because we do not experience all of these individual sensory experience, but we just think something tastes good. So what that also illustrated was that food perception begins actually before ingestion. Using our eyes and our nose, we can, first of all, assess the availability of food in our environment. We see whether it's available or not. We refer to this as the anticipatory phase of food perception. So typically when I show these three images of apples and I ask the audience which apple they would prefer, we have half of the audience choosing the green apple and justifying it with its assumed sour taste or crunchy texture. And the other half is probably going for the red apple and explaining that it has a supposed sweet taste and it's not that crunchy. Well, nobody chooses the very unappealing apple to the very left, of course. So once we decide to actually ingest the food, the taste and the smell are the senses that play a very important role during consumption. For example, the taste in this example here would be very much limited to the perception of sourness and sweetness, and not so much about the other taste qualities that I'm sure that Nick has explained in detail just before my presentation. And when it comes to smell, the perception of aroma can be categorized in thousands of different categories, each of which identify or helps identify that object for us. So flavor is actually happening when all of the sensory information comes together. The smell signal from the nose, the taste and texture signals from the mouth, the sound signal from the ear, and flavor is then not a sensory system by itself, but instead it is a signal that is generated or computed within our brains. And here in this illustration you see the complexity of the flavor network, and in color you see those areas highlighted that contribute to its perception. You see individual sensory areas like here the visual brain or somatosensory brain being active, and you also see here this rainbow colored area where all this information is actually coming together and generating that flavor experience. So, but why would the brain make such an effort to combine all the sensory bits of information? We know from multisensory research that having redundant information about one and the same object reduces ambiguity and it sharpens perception. So in the laboratory that manifests in two very typical effects. So the more senses represent a given object, the faster we will be to identify that object, and we will do that more accurately with more sensory information. The trick is, however, that the sensory information needs to be bound in a meaningful manner to actually establish coherent perception. So what does that mean? Take an example of a coffee shop. So what do you find there besides a lot of chatter, all kinds of smells and aromas from the people there and from the furniture? You do have coffee that you can see, you have coffee aromas, different types with and without milk, and you have various types of pastries and sandwiches that you can see and you can smell. So the hard task for the brain now is to really merge and bind those sensory attributes that belong to the very same object, like the sight of the coffee cup and the coffee aroma of, here in this case, maybe a strong espresso and not a cafe latte, for example. So, but how does the brain even know what is meaningful to combine in that sense? The answer is very simple. It is based on learning from our prior experiences of what the properties of a given food are. And accordingly, we form expectations when we encounter that food in the future. Here, as in the example of a breakfast cereal with strawberries and milk, we know its components and we know from experience what the sensory aspects of these components are. For example, the strawberry may be sour or sweet and moist in texture. And we know that there is no bitter taste to be expected. So when we talk about food, we do not care so much about response speed or acuity, but we really care about pleasure or pleasantness during consumption. So take that example of this very nice German bratwurst that you can find on every Christmas market right now. You see it, and just imagine you take a bite and it's savory, meaty, and hot. Something you would expect. So would that also mean that as you experience those different sensory bits of information, that with every bit pleasantness would also increase? Or would it maybe not change at all? And what if you take a bite and it is sweet and cold and totally unexpected? Would that lead to a decrease in pleasantness with the more information you're having? So we ask the question whether congruence actually matters, congruence between the sensory bits of information. And we address that in a series of studies, just showing you one here. We used different odors, orange and chicken, in various combinations in different proportions. And we paired each of these odors with either of two taste combinations. A sweet taste with a bit of citric acid and a savory taste with a bit of salt. So and you can see already that the chicken aroma and the savory taste would feel very congruent according to our experience, and orange aroma and a sweet taste with a bit of sourness would be very congruent as well, while the opposite combinations would be very unexpected. So what we find is actually that congruence really influences pleasantness in a way that what is congruent or familiar to us really also is more pleasant, indicated here by this very high correlation. So coming back to our example, what that means is, yes, if that sausage is really savory and hot, it would be more pleasant with the more information we have available. And if it was sweet and cold, we would very much dislike it. And these data very nicely show why we actually like most what we know best, and it may explain why it is so difficult to change habitual food patterns and to try and appreciate new things. But food perception can also be influenced by information, be it verbal or nonverbal, which elicits similar expectations as our experience really does. All of you have seen labels like these, like something is fat-free or organic, has no added sugar, etc. And there's a whole bunch of studies, of consumer science studies, showing that labeling a product with these pictograms or also with verbal labels influences consumer perceptions and also willingness to pay. For example, it has been shown numerous of times that a food that is labeled organic is reported to taste better, to contain less fat, and to contain more fibers, as compared to the very same food which is labeled with conventional production. Similarly, in a laboratory study, it has been shown that when we have a monosodium glutamate solution that we label as delicious, this one is perceived as more tasty than when the very same solution is labeled simply as MSG or glutamate. Although it is the identical stimulus, the verbal label really shapes its experience or perception. And we have observed in an entire series of studies very similar effects. And here in an example with salty solutions of 2 different intensities that we had paired with 3 types of labels indicating low salt, a neutral label, and indicating a high salt content, we actually see that when something is labeled low salt, no matter whether it's a low or a higher salt solution, it is perceived as less intense or stale, while when the same solution is labeled as high or added salt, it is perceived way more intense than it actually is with the neutral label. And giving you a more concrete example, humans and colleagues have produced a salmon flavored frozen mousse and presented it to participants with the label ice cream. And you all know what ice cream is like. It's sweet and creamy. So subjects, not surprisingly, really disliked it. Just picture yourself expecting strawberry ice cream and you get something that is tasting like salmon. So they very much disliked that ice cream or that snack, and they even said it is fairly bitter. While another group of subjects received the very same product with the label a new savory frozen mousse. They kind of appreciated, indicated here by the pleasantness ratings, and they rated it as much less bitter than the other group, really indicating again that the name or the label determines the flavor or the taste of that product. In a very vivid example, Sharon Spence has shown that when you give participants these M&M candies, which is just chocolates covered with sugar coating that is colored, and you ask them to rate the chocolatiness of each of these little candies, he found that the brown M&M candy was more chocolatey than all the other colors, which makes no sense given that they have the same ingredients, and the only aspect that makes them differ is their color. However, here is the color flavor association that we typically have with brown, and that is expecting chocolate. playing a trick on us, letting us experience the brown M&Ms as more chocolatey. And here just an example of different color flavor associations that we typically find in German participants. Probably works also in the US. That blue, for example, represents rather blueberry, flavored red, cherry, brown, chocolatey, and so on. So just showing these colors, people would have certain associations of a particular food flavor. I hope what I could show you so far is that perception really is subjective. Not only food perception, it works for perception in general, and that it is generated in our brains. What I perceive may not be the same than what you perceive. And to give you a more visual example, I have presented here two letters that look absolutely identical. They can be interpreted as the letter H or as the letter A with equal probability. However, when I give a context of other letters, here we would see the cat and we would interpret the first letter as H and the second one as an A, although they do not differ at all. So that illustrates that the context shapes our perception and that we are quite flexible with respect to that. Obviously, somebody who does not speak English may not have the same experience that I just explained here. So to sum up, all senses contribute to the flavor experience, and information, our prior experience, our learning, all influence the perception of food, the acceptance of food, and current and future food choices. And that is all based on the expectations as to the food properties that are elicited by those cognitive factors. So before I like to thank you for your attention, I would like to give you a very brief summary of what our research is all about. So what we study is not only these behavioral effects that I have just shown you, but we try to disentangle and to study the neuronal mechanisms that underlie the perception of food across the various senses, with a very strong focus on gustatory or taste perception, which is still the least explored sensory system. We study the interaction between the different senses and the cognitive effects that I have just presented to you in order to understand how they shape food perception and how they can be used to support healthy choices and to help actually also the sensory decline that our societies are currently facing, particularly. As we age, we lose sensory abilities. That is totally normal. However, when we cannot hear or cannot see so much anymore, we just get a hearing aid or we get glasses. Unfortunately, that does not work for the chemical senses taste and smell. So what happens is that we experience, as we age, less intense food, we have less pleasure during eating, and our quality of life is dramatically reduced. So understanding all of these mechanisms here will help us develop the most effective neurocognitive and sensory trainings to really counter all of these negative aspects that come with the sensory decline. And with that, I would very much like to thank you for your attention and close my presentation with that wonderful image. Thank you.